happening? Just waiting on our guest. Hope everyone is doing well. All right, I'm trying this setup. Might not work out too well. That's okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Unpopular Front, the podcast. Today, having on very smart history professor from the University of Washington. You might know him from the Michael Brooks Show. He was just recently on Katie Halper. And he's a really smart guy, Daniel Bessner. I'm going to be talking a little bit about something that might seem not applicable to right now, but if there's anything that I think the left is good at, there's a lot of things we're not very good at, even though we're right. Sometimes we're not very good at some things. But is understanding and applying the lessons of history to the modern world, to our struggles. And I wanted to talk with him. I was sort of inspired by the anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And, I saw a lot of interpretations of that struck me as both ahistorical and also simplistic, naive. And it just made me think in general about sort of how we, especially on the left, but I think just in general, it's something that even those who don't consider themselves on the left, in general, that frame is probably not even that helpful. How we can understand history, and specifically understand American imperialism, and the stories that were told that end up justifying the regime you're in now, or that came right after. And that makes me think we need to talk about the Cold War. Not about the Red Scare, not about, I'm sure that'll come up, but not about sort of the things that socialists always talk about when they talk about the Cold War. We're not going to talk about tankies, we're not going to talk about left comms or whatever the hell, but about how it affected us here in America, and how we had an option for a very different future that was represented by the last time there was a real left wing of the Democratic Party, and how that was defeated. So I'm very excited to speak with Daniel. We're just waiting for him to come on to the call. He'll be here soon, I'm sure. I'm early. But also, a really funny part about this is, of all things, the new Call of Duty game is a Cold War game. Oh, here we go. Daniel's here. We're going to talk about it. So if you enjoy Unpopular Front, check us out on all your podcast platforms. Go to unpopularfront.com. Hey, Maybe you'll find some things you like. All right, here we go. Just gonna let Daniel in, and we're gonna talk. All right. Let me make sure everything is cool. I have to use a fake background. I'm a Zoom boy. Zoom, zoom, a zoom, zoom, zoom. Riveting television. I know. Hmm. I obviously don't have a PMC joke. I'm not very good on Zoom. I know. You're not supposed to say that anymore. It's the new P word. Oh no. He's stuck.
Hey, man.
Oh hey, how's it going? Thanks for
Good.
coming
How
on.
you doing?
Oh, good. Very good. This is great. I love the track suit. It's kind of warm, right? I mean, but it's fine. It's a good look.
Yeah, it's the best. Like, I'm trying to hear. Let me try to get this a little less
Oh, sure. Yeah,
backlit.
no worries.
How do we do this?
Danny, what are you doing?
Okay, there we go. Yeah, much better.
Awesome. Great.
Actually, not much better. Okay, no, yeah, much better. Yeah, much better. Cool.
It's fine.
So ready to go when you are.
All right, great. Yeah, I'm recording already. Let me actually do the Zoom recording. This is all very. I'm not. I only use Zoom for podcasts, and it's normally with other people who are running the Zoom. So I'm trying my best. But yeah, thanks so much for coming on.
No worries. Let me actually go into.
Sure.
Yeah, this will hopefully be a little better. Let me see. Okay. Okay, cool. This is a little better.
All right, awesome, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, so I guess I kind of wanted to start with that Call of Duty game for some reason. I'm not like a big Call of Duty guy. Like I can't play those kind of games anymore. They just all the teenagers are so much better than me. But I'm curious to you as a historian. How do you think the use of things like video games are used to sort of retell history, kind of like as a way to maybe I wonder how in purposely propagandistic it is versus how it just sort of is how it's just indicative of the sort of retelling of history that maybe to you might not be very accurate.
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably depends on the specific histories that are being retold. So in the area that I'm most familiar with, which is military stuff, foreign policy stuff, the ones that jump out to me immediately are like the Call of Duty games and
Yeah.
other first-person shooters. And the way that I think about it is that it's well, I mean, in some sense, the games are always going to be militaristic, right? Sort of the nature of these games. They're
Right.
first-person shooters, and oftentimes you're going to be put in the sort of your avatar is going to be someone connected to the military, national security, or defense establishments.
Right.
And so there's kind of an innate militarism to them all. And it's interesting because I think if one were to do this, sort of, you could write an intellectual history of Call of Duty. I believe it first started as a World War II game, right? I think like the first ones you're invading Normandy.
Yeah.
So I think like you would be able to start, the American zeitgeist over the last 20, 22, 23 years, whenever the first one came out, probably in the late 90s or early 2000s. So, I mean, I think they're reflections of what's going on in the American psyche more than they are reflections of anything, even pretending to approach an actual historical event or tell a historical story. I watched the Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War game you sent me, the trailer you sent me, which is actually kind of interesting because you could really have like a million stories within the Cold War. It's interesting that they choose to tell it like as this is the story of the Cold War, and it used to be focused on typical CIA stuff, Vietnam. Ronald Reagan makes a cameo. So I think it just reflects various ideas about the American relationship with the world and the American psyche.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me. I recently read the new the Vincent Bevins book, the Jakarta Method, and he spoke about he described the Cold War as kind of being like, from this modern perspective, as being the method by which the sort of current global economic regime was sort of formulated, right? That, and sort of, I guess I wonder, sort of like, starting like when we say the Cold War, I realize this feels very elementary almost, but I feel like it's important to sort of understand that particular time of history and kind of like what really was the Cold War, and how did it relate to sort of the nations outside of the U.S. and the USSR, and how did the end of World War II lead to sort of that era?
Well, I think it depends on who you ask. Those are pretty big questions.
Yeah.
Sort of what led to the Cold War. So I think the Cold War has generally been described in various ways. On the sort of most basic level, it was obviously the geopolitical competition between the United States and Soviet Union for maybe not world hegemony, but hegemony over what were called the First and Second World. The First World, oftentimes referred to as the Free World, generally consisting of Europe and the Western Hemisphere, is sort of the imagination of that, with the Western Hemisphere, of course, being dominated by the United States. And then the Soviet Union, the Second World, or the Communist world, right? The Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union, when Sino-Soviet relations were better in the 50s and the 60s, uh, China. And then, of course, you have the Third World, or what is today referred to as the Global South, and which really emerged as sort of non-aligned countries kind of coming out of the Bandung Conference of 1955 and sort of forming their own alternative path. So on the broadest level, that's how you can understand the Cold War, the sort of interactions between the First and Second World, the free and quote-unquote communist world, and the Third World, Global South in there as well. On a sort of more macro level, you can understand it as the ideological fight between capitalism and communism. Capitalism, U.S. and the free world, and the communism, obviously, the Soviet Union and the communist world. In the United States, it was often framed as a struggle for democracy, but it was also kind of framed this way in the Soviet Union and elsewhere, and it depends on like how you define democracy. So I think most historians don't frame it around any sort of struggle for democracy. But from today's perspective, you could also understand the Cold War, and I think this is how I would understand it just from the purview of 2020. Is that it's kind of a story about the U.S. rise to global hegemon status, global power, superpower status, right? If you take the Cold War as a sub period in a longer trajectory, it's part of this larger 20th century into 21st century story of the United States becoming a global superpower. So I think that's broadly speaking what the Cold War was. When did it start? depends on who you ask, sometime between probably 1946 and 1949, depending on where you look and who you're talking about. And it ended, depending again on who you're talking about and where you look, sometime between 1989 and 1991. And so this was this great, you know, 4 decade long struggle, 42 to 44 years, 43 to 45 years, depending on who you ask, where you look, between these powers.
Yeah, yeah. And, at the start of the Cold War, what was the impression, sort of, at least that we can gather, of not so much the establishment leaders, but of the like common people? Because to me, my gut instinct would be, didn't we just fight a war with the USSR, really helping us destroy the Nazis, and that was the engine of so much American identity and the economy and politics too. And sort of how did that switch and that sort of change of focus happen? And I kind of go back to like a figure like Henry Wallace, and sort of how there seemed to be a possible other way to deal with that, but like why did we not go that way? Is it just sort of in that like crass materialist sense of, well, capital had a lot of power and they didn't want to fuck around?
No, I think again, this is like an enormous question.
I know.
So
I'm
for some,
sorry.
no, it's totally fine. It's great questions. Yeah, no, on some sense, like there's part of this enormous story is that like capital did benefit from fighting decades long war with another superpower, particularly defense contractors, but also after World War II, a bunch of corporations like RCA in a famous book called Capital Moves, I believe, gets like um, is imbricated with the American state, and like this Cold War provides excuses for American companies to sort of export to Europe or gain new markets, and so that's definitely an element of that. I would also say another important reason is that like people genuinely believe that the Soviet Union was, an evil empire. Stalin, at the time seemed a lot like Hitler, even though he had helped defeat the Nazis. There's a lot of Soviet behavior in the 30s. Stalin's behavior in particular, the Moscow trials, the authoritarianism of his rule. It wasn't crazy to analogize Hitler and Stalin necessarily at the time, though I do believe that historians have kind of figured out that Stalin really didn't have any designs on moving beyond his sphere of influence
Right.
in Eastern Europe, which he wanted to hold because obviously the Soviet Union or Russia into the Soviet Union had been invaded twice in a generation. So he wanted like a buffer zone, but I don't think he was really, trying to build a global empire. But it was difficult to know that at the time, right? And
Right.
then you could get into micro history of like, person X, what Churchill makes this speech, then Stalin makes this speech, and X,
Right.
and then there's all these micro moves. Stalin does this in Iran, blah blah blah, and that sort of cascading down to that made it appear to people on both sides of the so-called Iron Curtain that the other side was pretty aggressive.
Yeah.
But I also think I imagine this podcast takes a bit of a lefty bent. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would also say that American labor made a deal with the national security state.
Yeah.
And there's a book coming out by Michael Brenes, Brenes, Mike Brenes, and I want to get the name of the book right because it's important. It's called "For Might and Right: Cold War Defense Spending and the Making of American Democracy,"
Mhm.
and that should be coming out soon. And if people are interested in this question, I think Mike shows in detail like why and how labor basically became imbricated in the national security state. And people who don't know is that like when you if you examine the American labor history and sort of the broader history, particularly labor history after AFL-CIO merger, it's pretty conservative compared to other European countries, right? There's a conservative labor movement in this country, and so labor made a deal with the national security state, and congressmen, relied on national security pork to fund, various, local initiatives. The national security, Cold War provided a guiding logic of the American state and society after World War II. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons why You know, many people had military experience. They were familiar with what had just happened. You know, this mobilization against Hitler, which continued against Stalin. So I mean, it's a very broad question, but just in very broad strokes, those are the reasons. And just for people who are interested, I would say the two major books on the Cold War are is a book by a guy named It's ODD, Arna Westad, Westad, called The Global Cold War, which focuses on the ideological struggle and particularly focuses on the Cold War's um, effects in the global South. And then also an older book, but really, if you want that blow by blow, looking at why the United States fought the Cold War, you want to look at Mel Leffler's A Preponderance of Power. And then if you want to look at what the other side was doing, you want to look at a book by a guy named Vladislav Zubok, Zubok, and Konstantin Pleshakov, Pleshakov, called Inside the Kremlin's Cold War, which details what was going on in the Soviet Union. So those three books will give anyone who's interested, a sense of the Cold War and its general, early trajectory at least.
Yeah, yeah. So it's interesting that you mentioned how labor sort of became, yeah, I don't know, they made a deal, right, with the sort of growing national security state and I guess the growing military and industrial complex, although that speech hadn't been given yet, but because we both live in Seattle and Boeing is here. And the history of Boeing is very interesting to me, and I'm actually kind of curious, sort of, how did the Cold War and sort of the growth of companies like that, which I know what was its name originally before it was Boeing? I know there was another name.
No, it was actually Boeing, but there was a bunch of corporations that Boeing adopted. I believe
Yeah.
Boeing or William Boeing made his money off of timber in the Olympic Peninsula.
Yeah. Okay.
And so my understanding, and I apologize if I'm wrong about this, but my understanding is that Boeing made money off of timber, and then airplanes, of course, were made of wood. And so he was like a Musk-esque figure in the teens and sort of invested in the new science of aircraft.
I see.
Partially because he had made his money off of wood.
Right.
But Boeing over time buys, Douglas Aircraft and McDonnell merge. Boeing buys McDonnell Douglas, and then becomes like this sort of the story of the second half of the 20th century is the increasing monopolization of the defense industry. But sorry to interrupt.
No. That's helpful. I was thinking of McDonnell Douglas, but it's even more fitting that, of course, it was just a continuing kind of, just buying up other companies. It's capitalism. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
And and like, how did sort of the economic pressures sort of help subdue labor, which, especially as you mentioned in that time period, was very conservative, and I think we're seeing even the limits of that to a day. And how did that sort of economic deal, you think, sort of help give legitimacy to that growing national security state and military and industrial complex, and kind of enmesh these interests to a point to where, like, God, the cliche I always remember hearing is, they build a different part of X bomber in every different congressional district or whatever. I'm sure that's an urban legend or something, to basically ensure that every sort of constituency is implicated in this production, which then can sort of help give the legitimacy to the imperialism or to the different sort of aspects in that Cold War period, but which continues to this day.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to just emphasize. I don't think labor was necessarily subdued. I mean, I think, or that the national security state needed to construct legitimacy. I think a lot of people believed in it. I think a lot of people believed that the first half of the 20th century had demonstrated a few things. It demonstrated that organizations like the League of Nations and the United Nations, which was founded 44, 45, weren't necessarily able to stop war. It demonstrated that reason and discussion weren't necessarily going to stop war. especially after the horrors of World War II, not only the war but the Holocaust. I think it made a lot of people believe that like human beings were their worst selves,
Right.
and that like you only needed to um, basically human beings needed to be subdued or controlled as opposed to allowed to flourish. And so these were a lot of you know people didn't just abandon the left or socialism because they were stupid, right? I think a
Right.
bunch of their own experiences, both personal experiences and their reading of history, had demonstrated particular things. And one of these things, again, related to like what is human nature, right? And I think whether we are explicit about it or not, I think a lot of that, how you answer that question, what is human nature, informs people's politics. And a lot of people thought that human nature was pretty venal and pretty vicious, and that you needed to be controlled by force, human beings and their impulses by force. And this was basically read up onto the international arena, right? And so this is what a lot of people believed. And then so you get like that experience, and then you get um, and we could talk about it if you want to, but I mean, I think Stalin was pretty brutal at points.
Yeah.
And so like he didn't exactly give, the left or communism a good name. Um, a lot of people were, very familiar with the Social Democrats in Weimar, who I think they were read as like not stopping Hitler, and I think that's a little unfair. But
Mhm.
at the time, socialism, socialist politics seemed a little bit feckless. And then people turned toward what might be called a muscular liberalism, a national security liberalism, maybe even a Cold War liberalism, even though that term's a bit opaque, for these reasons. And I think that was a real big reason why the national security state took the form that it actually did. And if we want to prevent sort of these processes from happening, I think we have to truly understand why it happened. And things are never just a top down affair. The U.S. state didn't necessarily just legislate or force people to do this, but people followed it because it conformed to their beliefs, confirmed what they wanted to think, confirmed what they did think, and then they also did get material benefits, like from in particular Massachusetts or Seattle, where there's these enormous defense contractors. Actually, where I am right now in Southern California, these big defense contractors. Provided material benefits to the community, right? And I think this is a big problem that I would say is that in the U.S. context, socialist politics have almost always been linked to militarism.
Yeah.
So you think about the first great expansions of federal housing. A lot of them actually occurred during World War II to house war workers. And I think you have to consider things like, the connection between social democratic expansion and then also militarism in this country at least.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point because I feel like that is a direct contradiction with maybe the old left and the new left, and then whatever left we're in now. With sort of the rise of anti-war movements becoming more definitional, at least, and then also the fact that a lot of these the closest things that we have in America to democracy, like you mentioned, are so rooted in that military and in that expansion and in that state. So I'm not really sure how we deal with that exactly, but it's a contradiction that I do think some people on the left try to just sort of brush away one side of it without accepting these challenges in that. One
Yeah,
thing that yeah, go on. No, totally.
I was going to say if you go back to like the late 19th century, I mean, socialists are thinking about these things like the role of military violence and the role of um, military thoughts or not really thought, military practice and its relation to socialism. I would recommend an essay in a volume titled Makers of Modern Strategy. I believe it's by a guy named Sigmund Neumann, and I believe it's called Friedrich Engels as a Military Thinker. And he argues that Engels actually spent a lot of time. Yeah, it's called War and Revolution. Friedrich Engels as a military thinker, basically. I think that's what it's called. And so, yeah, as a okay, War and Revolution. Friedrich Engels as a military. Oh no, fuck it, that's the wrong essay. Anyway, whatever. Go to this volume,
Yeah,
Sigmund Neumann,
yeah.
his essay on Engels. Fine. But read it. But anyway, this was a very important thing. It's not a surprise that like someone like Trotsky wanted to control the Red Army. right?
Right.
These are important things, and obviously there were socialist militaries, still are the people, what are the People's Liberation Army.
Yeah.
I think that's still what it's called in China. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but also throughout the communist world. So, I mean, this is just something American. Again, I think a lot of the pathologies, I actually, not again, but I've said it before, but I think a lot of the pathologies that the American left about not taking like very basic questions seriously is because they were so fully destroyed
Hmm.
over the past 100 years by the American government. So there's a lot of what I would call political immaturity, strategic immaturity on the left, because it's mostly been about cosplay,
Yeah.
as it has been about government. It's been like way more about cosplay than it's been about governing. Um,
Totally.
I don't think that's socialists' fault. I think like the American state made a very concerted effort to guarantee that lefties never, ever, ever hold power. So I'm not blaming it,
Right.
but we also have to recognize like there's a reason conservatives don't get as mad when you debate the relative merits between Oakeshott and Burke, right? Only lefties get mad when you're arguing, the relative worth of a
No
thinker.
kidding.
So there's a yeah.
I know, gosh. Yeah, I feel like we haven't even made it to the second international still. I feel like we're still stuck on the first one. But yeah, that lack of sort of strategic seriousness, that immaturity, which again, I that's a really great way of putting it, to where it's not their fault. It's not like we're trying to have some like moral condemnation and like you need to grow up, but it just sort of shows just how pushed down the left in America has been for so long. You know, it's like we're like those Japanese watermelons that are like grown in the little tiny box, and it can never grow out any bigger because we're constantly being pushed down. But, we can maybe push back in some way, and also we can try to grow in our own way because we are not watermelons. We are actually smart and have brains. And, oh, yeah.
No, I was just going to say I think that's absolutely correct, and I don't mean to be condemning anyone. I mean, it's just like, what are you going to do to maintain an ideology when you have basically a fundamentally political ideology when you have no access to political power, right? You have
Yeah.
to maintain it somehow, and it winds up becoming about intellectual discussion, which is fine. I like intellectual discussion as much as the next guy. But yeah, no, I think it's just worth being self-critical and whatnot.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. And yeah, so I kind of wonder, in this Cold War period, this is a thing that I sort of remember hearing, especially sort of coming to the left and, trying to kind of make sense of the Cold War and the USSR, and is was this idea that because of the Cold War, there was maybe some pressure put on the American ruling class around issues around race and around civil rights. And I kind of, that the idea that like the USSR could use that as propaganda. I can think of like, there were many like black communists who, at the early stages of the USSR, would travel there and be treated, very very well, as sort of as it's a good piece of propaganda, right? And especially considering the like movements that are happening right now and the focus on racial justice. I'm curious from your perspective as an expert on this topic. How correct is that aspect of it, and is that something that we could use in our modern movements to kind of connect some of these sort of imperialist and militarist struggles with these more domestic issues of sort of interclass dynamics and identity issues?
No, those are great questions. So I just want to make sure before I begin,
Sure.
I'm coming through okay, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You're good.
Okay, cool. So the classic book on this is the work of a brilliant historian named Mary Dudziak, Dudziak, called Cold War Civil Rights. And she argues persuasively, like one of the reasons that the United States made bill reforms to civil rights laws, and one of the reasons that the civil rights movement was successful, is that the Soviet Union made use of anti-African American, anti-Black propaganda in order to try to win more adherence in the so-called third world, right? What I talked about at the beginning. To put this in the larger context, I would say for the first 15 or so years of the Cold War, from 1947 to 1962, the Cold War is really a battle in Europe. There's a lot of like jockeying. The United States, rhetorically supports, actually tells East Germans who rebel in June 1953 that they would arm them. Doesn't actually arm them. The Soviet Union sent in tanks to stop the Hungarian uprising, hence the term tanky in 1956. And there's a lot of like psychological stuff, warfare going on, and weapons, and radio for Europe, and broadcasting, and blah 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 blah. This eventually leads to a head in the early 1960s. Most famously, in October 1962 is the Cuban Missile Crisis, right, where the United States and Soviet Union really they really almost exchanged nuclear weapons. Like that was a live possibility. It didn't happen for a variety of reasons, but that's one moment. And then between 1958 and 1962, there's a crisis called the Second Berlin Crisis, which is whether or not, Khrushchev essentially makes a threat that all the allies, the French, the British, and the Americans, need to remove all their people from Berlin. Otherwise, he's just going to seize control of the city, or let the East Germans seize control of the city, I believe was specifically what he said. So if they don't remove troops in 6 months, they don't remove troops in 6 months, but Khrushchev doesn't do anything, but there's this like tension. This eventually comes to a head again, also in, I believe, 1963. I can't believe I'm not remembering this exactly. Let me just see. In October,
give you terrible marks.
Yeah, I think it's October 1963. So it's a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and a month before JFK is murdered in November '63. Let me just make sure these dates are actually important. Oh God. No, okay, so it's 61. It's October '61. So right before the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, I can't believe I got that wrong. Jesus Christ. Right before the Cuban Missile Crisis, American and Soviet tanks face off against each other at Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin. You could actually go to this area today if you're ever in Berlin. They face off against each other, and it's like, are they going to fire? They don't fire, and there's no war. But basically, after these two incidents, the incidents at Checkpoint Charlie and the Cuban Missile Crisis, both the United States and the Soviet Union decide they're not going to fight a nuclear war, right? Have you ever heard of like the red telephone?
No.
Like that
Yeah. The like special phone that the leader will have, and yeah.
So basically, they installed like the red telephone after the Cuban Missile Crisis in the White House and in the Kremlin, so that you'd be able to talk directly to each other, right? And that you begin to get the drawing down of tensions, right? You get proto détente, the easing of tensions, which really comes to fruition under Nixon and Kissinger in the '70s. Okay, but anyway, so what happens is that the Cold War ends in Europe, and so you get a shift to the global south, right? Now the global war becomes truly global, and you're going to have each side try to win over nations of the global south, what is then the third world, and because non-alignment like kind of failed, and people are really going to start aligning with the Soviet Union. People already do earlier, but whatever. So what people argue, I think rightly, is that the Soviets were able to make use of propaganda that was anti-American because of the American oppression of Black Americans, American states' oppression of Black Americans, because the Cold War shifted to the global South. Now, the question is there an analogous situation today where similar propaganda could work on the international stage? It's tough to know, because I think my hair is insane. I'm sorry.
It's okay, it's fine. That's why I shave my head. Honestly, it was getting too nuts.
Yeah, it's just like all over the place.
Yeah.
It looks crazy. But anyway, yeah, it looks like kind of fascist actually.
Hey.
But anyway,
that's a style for lots of people nowadays. Don't worry.
Yeah, it's actually funny, but that's also something one could talk about. But so anyway, the question is there an analogous situation today? I don't know. I mean, the United States is the world's superpower. It definitely is not trying to win over hearts and minds as much. In fact, Donald Trump certainly doesn't give a shit about winning over hearts and minds. And this is actually one of my big questions. I think that what we're going to see is an American empire without much cultural power, but with a lot of political, military, and economic power.
Right.
So it would just be, instead of like an empire and invitation, just like by an empire by reality. And so that might be something we're going to see. I don't know what the Biden administration does. My guess is that if should Biden win, my guess is that a lot of the foreign policy people would want to like trumpet the importance of a liberal international order. I don't think that's really possible, but to be decided.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And that idea of America kind of being, yeah, having less and less cultural power, but still having a giant military, and still that kind of actually brings up another question I had, and sort of how does this relate both to the history of the Cold War, but also these sort of broader foreign policy questions now, is the importance of the dollar. That's a thing I don't really get. Like I've heard it explained so many times, sort of how the dollar is sort of one of the main currency exchanges, but also how does oil and the dollar both kind of play into that version of the American empire that we have now? And you can tie it back to the Cold War, but I realize that is also a very gigantic question.
No, sure. Well, I'll just preface my answer by just making clear I'm not an expert on the international political economy. I mean, I have an interest as someone who's concerned with American empire and understanding dollar dominance, but this isn't my true field.
Sure.
If you want to look to someone for that, Yakov Fagin, Feygin, is someone who works on these types of issues. So yeah, he's really good. But anyway, so for my limited understanding is that because of the dollar is the world's reserve currency, the United States essentially doesn't have to worry about deficits. It can basically spend as much as it wants on whatever it wants, and this is important because we have a $740 billion military budget, which I, there's a lot of like budgetary play, but it's like maybe half of the discretionary budget, something along those lines, or a third of the discretion. Should have these statistics directly at hand, but anyway, it allows the United States to spend a lot, and it forces other countries to basically acquiesce to American wishes because global trade is denominated in dollars, and if they want access to dollars, they need to listen to the security state. How does it relate to the Cold War? It just shows how beginning in 1945, but the decision made during World War II. But let's say really starting in during World War II and continuing after, the United States constructed um, both a system of global security defined by the famous 800 bases. Today, it's actually the numbers seem to be around 750 bases, and the enormous budget, the drones, etc., endless war. But also, in addition to that sort of security arrangement, they also constructed a global political economy organized around institutions like the World Bank, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and later the IMF and other or organizations that these institutions transmuted into or became slightly different institutions. But anyway, they also constructed the system of international political economy. And so that's what I think is important to understand is that the US basically controls the levers of both of what is called in like poli sci in very gendered ways, but whatever hard power, political security, and economic power.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That is kind of funnily gendered. I don't know. I'm a nanny, so yeah, I'm all over the place with that. But yeah, no, that's great. I realize you have to go in a little bit, but I am very curious about about kind of the way that this is brought up so much. Cold War, just as like a concept that is used right now a lot in relationship to China, and I've sort of been operating under the assumption that the economies of China and the U.S. are so much more linked than the U.S. and USSR were, that we're not going to have that kind of a conflict, but also China is a growing power. It is in. I know this is a thing that gets some people online very mad, but I feel like they have imperialist tendencies, right? And they are powerful in the way that we are powerful, and sort of how as they grow and America just domestically is just in just a crisis after crisis, and I can't help but feel like we are in a moment of decline, and sort of how can we use the lessons of history to sort of help prepare ourselves and to understand some of the dynamics that play now around sort of U.S.-China relationships.
Yeah, I think it's very important and very true that the Chinese and American economies are today much more integrated than the American and Soviet economies ever were. And that's really important. But then again, you can't forget like the economies of Western Europe and Central Europe were very integrated before World War One, and they fought, vicious World War One. So that's not necessarily. I mean, liberal interdependence theory, doesn't necessarily always hold true. So that doesn't necessarily prevent the war. However, that being said, I don't see how the United States would actually fight a meaningful war with China because I just don't think the United States would fight World War III with China over either Taiwan or I mean, so the U.S. would definitely not fight World War III over like the oppression of the Uyghurs or
Yeah.
the oppression of Hong Kong, because that's clearly considered to be basically within China's sphere of interest, right? Whether that's is that ideal from the perspective of humanity? No, but in the language of geopolitics, that's what's going on.
Right.
So the real question is: was the United States fight World War III if the People's Republic actually invaded Taiwan? Or could Taiwan, repel an initial invasion? And there's like a lot of military things, but I just don't think the United States would commit to outright World War III on either the Republican or Democratic side in Taiwan. So that's like the fundamental reality there. So my guess is that I do think China has ambitions to be a regional hegemon. I think China wants to be number one in the entire whatever Eastern Hemisphere. It wants to be more dominant than India, than Japan, than the Philippines, than Taiwan, than Korea, South Korea, whatever. So that is, I think, what China is going to go for. So my prediction is that China is going to start making these moves. The United States will, in the next 50 years, basically leave the region. It can't remain in East Asia forever. It can remain tied in various ways, but I think the era of truly global U.S. dominance is at an end. And then my guess is the regional powers, like you'll see, Indo-Japan alliances. There probably already stuff happening that I'm not an expert on. You're already seeing with China backing up with Pakistan. So I think that's what will happen in the future. And I think the United States will retreat from the region. And I think primarily the new Cold War language is advocated by people within the United States, both within like the think tank world. And my guess would be like defense contractors are like heightening threats of China because they want these types of defense production programs that also Congress members want as well.
Yeah.
And I'm sure I'm not an expert on China, but I can't imagine there aren't interests there that are also promoting Chinese-U.S. tension for very, for pecuniary gain. And I don't think either nation wants a full-out war. However, of course, this is always a risk. Like you can't predict what's going to happen. So I think just in general, you always want to ratchet down tensions. Plus, I'm against defense contractors getting a blank slate and what have you. So I think this is why I think it's important to attack the rhetoric of a new Cold War. But I think that you could also think about it in this way, right? Like the American security state has since 1945 been premised on having existential enemies. It was the Soviet Union, communism, international communism throughout the Cold War. There was a bit of an interregnum in the 1990s where the logic of American empire, which the budget in fact was decreased, but the logic of American empire became about like the responsibility to protect, to like end Holocaust and genocide, and you still see that in liberal internationalism. People like Samantha Power still firmly believe that. Hillary Clinton, I think, also to a degree, and Marie Slaughter also. And I think after 9/11, you got like Islamic terrorism to become the threat du jour. So it's another sort of, existential threat, good guy, bad guy, easy thinking, Manichaean thinking. But it's become clear 20 years after 9/11, like Islamic terrorism is not an existential threat to the United States, even if there were, a series of so-called terrorist attacks. And so I think China seems appealing to people because it's a great power. There's a billion people. You could be racist against them. They're very different culturally and politically. And so I think it provides, a logic to a lot of these capitalist interests. And people who also believe it, people really believe it as well. People believe their own bullshit to promote this type of new Cold War.
Wow. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. That's a thing to a lot to chew on with Daniel Bessner. Are you Dr. Daniel Bessner, by the way?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I am doctor. Yeah.
Oh, Dr. Bessner. All right, very, very good. Well, I have to say thank you so much for coming on, and you got a busy schedule, as has been mentioned. If we had elected Bernie Sanders, who knows? Maybe you would have been. I mean, this forum, this you're. I feel like you're on the cutting edge of a new sort of approach to American foreign policy, and I really appreciate your time. So thank you so much,
Thanks.
Daniel.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely, man. All right. Well, I will. I'll send you a link when it's all done. All right.
Perfect. I
Great.
hope it was okay.
No, it was very, very good. So, all right then, man.
Okay, cool.
Thanks.
Take it.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
All right, that was Daniel Bessner from University of Washington speaking with me. Thank you so much, Daniel. That's right. My camera changed. Now it's a different thing. You can see the background. But if you enjoy on Popular Front, please share it with a friend. Good God, that would be so nice. Go to unpopularfront.com, find the links to the YouTube channel, follow me on Twitter at Ben Yudishin. Hey, it's all good stuff. And if you like the live streams, if you like the video, tell me. Thanks. All right. Bye.